Thank you for tuning in to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Whether you're listening during your commute, while working out, or just relaxing at home, we appreciate you. Every download, every listen, and every subscription means a lot. Up next, the 12 Kyle podcast.
Is there money in podcasting? There is money in podcasting. Is there enough money in podcasting for you to quit your job? Probably not, to be honest. And I speak for myself as well. But I didn't get into it to make money because if I'd gotten into it to make money, I wouldn't be where I am today as far as this podcast is concerned, because it's not generating a whole bunch of money. It's probably generating enough money for me to take my daughter to the little ice cream parlor down the street and get some ice cream. And for others, it might not generate a dime. And that's okay, because there has to be a certain love that you want to do. And again, I'm not projecting my success or failures on you. I'm just being honest. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy 12 Kyle. I want to thank you all for tuning in as you do each and every week. Shout out to those of you who are watching on YouTube. Man, check this out. So I'll be honest. I get asked a lot about podcasting. When I see people in the streets, when I come across, people I've gone to school with or something like that, or maybe my hometown, or just even online, people will ask about, starting their own podcast. And one of the things that I always try to do is give as much information as I can, because there's a lot of information to give people, and there's really no right or wrong way to do it. But you should have some parameters. And I think a lot of times people who don't have parameters, more often than not, usually end up spinning their wheels. And so what I try to do is offer, I don't even want to say advice, I just give a little game. Shout out to the Too Much Game podcast with the host, Uncle Dolomite. But I try to do just that. I try to give game because I think it's important that you give people as much information as you can, and then they can make the educated decision to either move forward or not do it at all. And I'll speak as someone as a tenured veteran of this podcast game, been in it over 10 years now, coming up on 11 years. You see it close to 750 episodes at the time of this recording. And I'm a veteran. And I'll be honest, I have two really, really dope podcasts. I don't think I'm being facetious when I say this. I have two really, really good podcasts, and it's something that I take pride in. That being said, I'm not an expert, but the running joke that I do tell my friends, I'm a professional. I am truly a professional. But in all seriousness, I try to give game to people who ask, because that's the way that they'll find out. Because for some, you really won't understand what podcasting is until you get in it. And for others, it's almost the equivalent of watching a football game from the stands. When you watch it from the stands, the game looks a certain way. When you get on the field and you're on the sidelines, it looks a different way. When you're actually in the game, baby, it's showtime. And it's really not for the faint of heart, but it all depends on what you want to do. So I wanted to talk on here on this episode about, starting a podcast and everything that goes with it, just kind of like a tutorial. Feel free to take notes. Again, I'm not an expert. I just play one on TV. I think the biggest thing is, when you're starting a podcast, one of the most important things that you have to do is define your concept. Personally, it was important for me to define who 12 Kyle was, which I'd already had a build up, as far as I had a blog, and then I had an internet radio show, and all of that morphed into this particular podcast. But everybody doesn't have that type of base. So for some, that mindset of defining what your podcast concept is may be a little bit foreign to some. And for others, it may be a little bit difficult because you're trying to take all of your concept and your ideas and put them into one big bowl. And you're going to add several ingredients to make it happen. But, you got to like what's in that bowl, and you got to know what's in the bowl as far as your ingredients. If not, it's not going to come out the way that you want it to come out. So one of the first things in defining your podcast concept is you want to be able to articulate to yourself and others what it is that you want to achieve from podcasting. I think that's very, very important because it gives you a goal. It gives you a mindset. It gives you a purpose. Now, for some, they see people with podcasts, and trust me, at the time of this recording, there's over 5 million podcasts. Probably 3 million of them are active. And so, it's important that you have an idea as to what you want to do and what you want to achieve from your podcast, because here's the real. If you don't have a goal, if you don't have ideas as far as how you want it to work, it's probably not going to work, right? There's a question I always ask. Question number one, I always ask people when they start talking about podcasting is, are you willing to do it for free? And if your answer is no, then you probably shouldn't start. Because the thing is that most of you who are going to start a podcast are going to do it for free. Is there money in podcasting? Yes, there is money in podcasting. Is there enough money in podcasting for you to quit your job? For you, probably not, to be honest. And I speak for myself as well. But I didn't get into it to make money, because if I'd gotten into it to make money, I wouldn't be where I am today as far as this podcast is concerned, because it's not generating a whole bunch of money. It's probably generating enough money for me to take my daughter to, the little ice cream parlor down the street and get some ice cream. For others, it might not generate a dime, and that's okay, because there has to be a certain love that you want to do. And again, I'm not projecting my success or failures on you. I'm just being honest. If you don't come in with a built-in base, if you will, if you're not probably a former athlete or a movie star or somebody like that, you probably don't have hundreds of thousands of people who are going to sit and watch your podcast. And so you're not going to be able to generate the revenue that you're thinking that is going to take you to the next level. But you want to have an idea as to how and what you want to achieve from your podcast. If you don't have that, then you're wasting your time. Who are you creating your podcast for? I think that's a very valid question. That's usually the second question that I ask. Who are you creating your podcast for? And the reason why I ask that question is because there has to be someone or someone's multiple people who you're creating your content for. Is it to talk about certain things? Is it to talk about certain people? Is it to reach a certain audience? Are you a new mom who wants to talk about, developing a child and, balancing motherhood and the workplace? Are you going toward that niche, if you will? Or are you someone who wants to get on a podcast and talk about hardware? Or you want to just get on the podcast and talk about what's happening in entertainment? You want to get on a podcast and talk about sports? You have to have an idea who you're creating it for. Because again, if you don't have a specific niche as to who you want to create the podcast for, you will be the hamster on the wheel for sure. For me, I remember my niece, my lovely niece Taylor, asked me a few years ago when she was in college. She interviewed me about the podcast, and she said, "Well, why are you doing the podcast, Uncle Kyle?" And I told her why. And when I told her, I could see the light bulb go off. And one of the things that I said, and I'm paraphrasing, was, if these mediums are around for, another 100 years, there'll be a generation of my ancestors who will be able to listen to me and my thoughts. I don't know what my grandfathers thought about how they dealt with, living in the Jim Crow South, or dealing with civil rights or anything, or dealing with the wars. I don't know what my great grandparents went through as far as slavery was concerned. But I think with this medium, if these mediums stay around, my great grandkids will be able to press a button and hear what I think about whatever I'm talking about. It's the 12 Kyle podcast. It's not the let me tell you what I think about Hollywood podcast. It's not the NFL Today podcast. It is the 12 Kyle podcast. And it's generally and genuinely about whatever I wanted to talk about at that moment that I sat down. And I'll be honest, just from a personal perspective, I feel very good and happy when people tell me, hey, I relate to that. I totally understand where you were coming from. I appreciate your podcast. But that's the currency for me. Props is the currency. It's not going to translate into dollars to the point where I'm going to quit my 9 to 5. If it does, that would be great. But I'm never going to quit my 9 to 5 to do my podcast if the podcast becomes an iteration of something that I never wanted it to be. That's never going to happen. And so in chasing numbers and in chasing dollars, the one piece of advice I would give is that you make sure that if your podcast begins to blow up, that you keep it authentic to who you are and what your message is. Because if not, you will be feeding the monster. And what I mean by that is, it's cool to go viral, but you can't keep cranking out those numbers. And the more numbers that you crank out for going viral, the more and more outlandish stuff you'll have to do or say to get those numbers, to get those eyes. And quite frankly, it's not worth it. At least to me, it's not. For some of y'all, it might be. And then the next thing I always ask is, why should your audience listen to you? What makes you different from anybody else? I told you at the beginning of the podcast, I have 2 great podcasts. I tell you every time on the Rap Soul podcast, it's the best music podcast that you've never heard, because for most people, they've never heard it. But I want them to tap in, and when they're finished listening to it, the episode is so dope. It was like, you know what? That was a dope podcast. It's probably the best podcast I've never heard. And so that's what I want to compare it to. That's what I want you to compare it to when you're done listening. The 12 Kyle podcast is such that the way that I describe it to people who've never seen it or listened to it is that it's like a potato chip. You eat one, you're going to eat another. And I say that in realizing that every episode isn't for everybody. I understand that if I get on here and I'm talking about, Jay-Z versus Nas, there's a segment of the population that don't want to hear that. And I'm cool with that. But for the 500 people that do and are in the comments going back and forth, that's what it's about. But it's about what I care about and what I feel like once I turn the mic on and once I turn the mic off. But you have to give yourself and give the people the authentic version of you. So why should they listen to you? Because again, if there are 3 million active podcasts, why should anybody pick you? And that's a valid question. That's not a hater. That's being honest. Why should anybody pick the 12 Kyle podcast? Because I got a cool little Yankees hat on? Because I got a fly background? Because I went to South Carolina State? No, none of that matters. It's a connection. So you have to find what your purpose is for podcasting. And little known fact, they say 95% of the inactive podcasts never make it past episode 10. And the reason why that probably happens, and this is just my educated guess, is that people get into it and they think that because you have a podcast and because you send it out to 100 of your family and friends and you tagged everybody on LinkedIn and you tagged everybody on Facebook and you hit the group chats. And so you've basically circled your social wagons, if you will, and you have reached out to 500 people to listen and 7 of them listen. That can and probably will happen because everybody doesn't listen to podcasts and everybody don't listen to podcasts on the same type of schedule. For me, especially when I was driving into an office, they were perfect to listen to in the car because it was a distraction from being stuck in this Atlanta traffic. But some people do it when they listen when they're, on their way to the gym or in the gym. Others just don't listen to podcasts at all. And then there are actually a lot of people who will prefer that 30-second clip. And so if you put a clip out there, it better be your best shot. because for some, that's all that they're going to consume is that clip. I can tell you that as a known fact. There are episodes where, like, I put out a clip at the time of recording, maybe about a month or so ago, and this one clip alone, a 45-second clip, had 12,000 plus views on YouTube. But the actual YouTube video, which was maybe 17 minutes, only had 50 views. It happens. I ain't tripping. It happens. The hope is that of that, those thousands of people who saw the clip, that there'll be 5 or 6 that'll say, you know what, let me finish listening and watching this and see what this is about because I'm interested. But like I said, you got to find your purpose on what your podcast goals are. And then you have to narrow it down. You have to ask yourself, like, who's your ideal listener? Who am I targeting? I don't do episodes for specific ages, but a lot of my content, because I'm old and washed, is for people who are older, well, not old and washed like me, but I mean, I'll just give you an example. Like, my demographic is really between 35 and 55. Those are the people who really, really rock with this podcast. The numbers show. And I'm not a big numbers guy, but I will tap into the numbers, once every quarter or so. But yeah, that's my demo. That's my demo right there. 35 to 55. Now, I have younger listeners and I have older listeners, but my demographic is going to be that generation of people. And then as you define who your ideal listeners are, you ask yourself, what do they care about? What do they want to hear? Now, for me, and I'll just make this as personal as possible, I make the content that I want to make. I'm kind of like Prince. Remember when in Purple, shout out to Purple Rain. Remember in Purple Rain when the promoter told Prince, hey, you make the kind of music you want to make, and nobody's into the shit that you're into. That's me. Every episode that you've heard on the 12 Kyle podcast and the Rap Soul podcast have been episodes that I want to do. I'm never going to do an episode where somebody suggests, hey, you should talk about this. No, I'm not. Unless it's something I want to talk about. But every episode is going to be something that I want to go back and listen to and 10 years from now and be like, okay, I remember talking about that. Okay, that was cool. Like that. But, for some, they want to know what their listener thinks. They want to know what their listener is struggling with. And they ask themselves, how can they speak their listener's language? Me, not as much. Not as much because, again, I'm not really that tapped into trying to appease the other people. I want every episode to be dope. And that's it. As long as I give you dope content, that's all that matters. But I'm giving you Kyle. I'm giving you 100% of me. And to me, that's all that matters. And then obviously, when you get further along down the line, one thing that's important, as I just mentioned, is choosing your topics. What do you want to talk about? Personally, what has worked for me, and I live by it and I stand by it, is creating content that is evergreen, meaning that if you listen to an episode in January, you can flip to an episode in July. And, I'm not dealing with current events. So there's nothing that you're going to miss. So you don't have to start this episode. Let's just say you just started listening to the 12 Kyle podcast or the Rap Soul podcast for the first time. You don't have to go back to episode 702 if I'm on episode 735. You see what I'm saying? Like, you don't have to. You can, but it's not, and I love it when people binge listen. But none of my topics fall in line like that on either platform. But you want to choose your topics based on, your reasons for podcasting, and reasons for, why you think your audience may tap in. Another thing that's very big once you get your podcast going is creating a format and a schedule for yourself. One of my biggest frustrations as a listener, because I am someone not only who creates content, but I love listening to podcasts. And a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, because the people who are on those podcasts are on this podcast. They've been on here as guests. But the thing that I will say is having a schedule is very important. You guys know that we're dropping new episodes every Thursday for both podcast platforms. I may move it around. I may move Rap Soul to Sundays. I might move it to Mondays. But either way, when I'm creating content, you're getting it weekly, or if you want to, make your podcast bi-weekly, you can do that. Or if you want to make it monthly, but you have to get your listener on a schedule as to when you're going to have something for them to listen to. There's nothing worse than, you dropping content, let's say every Tuesday, and then, you drop Tuesday the 1st, and then when the 8th rolls around, you don't drop an episode. And then the following week after that, you don't drop an episode. Then you drop one, and 3 weeks later, basically, and then you're sitting around wondering why nobody listened. Well, nobody listened because the people who listen to you come back each week, and they're going to keep coming back. But if they keep coming back and not seeing anything or hearing anything, then you give them no reason to try it again. And again, there's 3 million other podcasts for them to listen to. Why should they listen to you if you're not consistent? You have to be consistent. If you're not consistent with your content, your listeners won't be consistent with listening. It's as simple as that. And I've seen and heard podcasters get upset about that. And the only person that you can blame is yourself, because you're the reason why they left. If you're not there, then they can't make the podcast for you. But in doing that, you also want to make sure that you figure out how it is that as you're making your schedule, what type of podcast you're going to have. Are you going to be a solo podcaster like me? Are you going to have a co-hosted show where you have interviews and where you're interviewing people? Will you be reporting? Will you be a storyteller? This is where it gets tricky for me and other podcasters, because I think some people like what they like. Some people don't want to hear a solo podcaster talk for 30 minutes. Some people don't, and that's cool with me. I'm fly with that. It's okay. If you got just something dope, like Too Much Game, I'll listen. Uncle Dolomite chop it up for an hour. Personally, I don't think I could talk for an hour, but if I had to, I would. But the way that he does it and crafts his podcast episodes is brilliant. Or you can do a co-hosted show like Pod and Saved Our Marriage with King Germ and Queen Germ. But those are two co-hosts. The thing that gets tricky about co-host is if there ever is an issue, whether or not the issue is on the podcast or off the podcast, it's going to affect the podcast. And what I mean by that is, if, like, let's just say, I don't know, let's say me and Baylor. Let's say me and Baylor have a podcast together. Shout out to BTG for President is his podcast. If Baylor and I have a podcast together, and then let's say we do it for 6 months, and then all of a sudden I don't want to do it anymore, his podcast might be done, or the podcast that we share may be done, because maybe he can't create or want to create as a solo podcaster. Queen Germ and King Germ, their podcast works because they're married, so it's likely that as long as they're married, they're probably still going to be doing his podcast. I don't know how she puts up with him, but hey, she's got to be a saint. Shout out to King Germ. That's the homie. But yeah, so it gets very tricky, and that's why I've been approached before in the years past about, doing podcasts with people and stuff like that. And I've always kind of shied away from it, because I know the moment that it feels like work, or the moment that I don't feel like I have a say or control of it, I'm done. But the thing about it was that I knew if I created the 12 Kyle podcast and the Rap Soul podcast, that I could make it be whatever it wanted to be. If I wanted to come on here and talk about unicorns for 20 minutes, there's some people that would sit and listen to me talk about unicorns. So you got to get a format. You got to get a schedule. General rule of thumb, if you're doing a daily podcast, you probably don't want to make it any longer than 10, 15 minutes. If you're doing a weekly podcast, either solo or with someone else, try to stay within 30 to 60 minutes. if you're doing a podcast, any, let's say every 2 weeks or monthly, you probably could go over an hour, but you want to be careful. Most podcast platforms, they will tell you that, 50% of listeners, want to hear a podcast for at least 30 minutes. So as long as you stay within that sweet spot, you're okay. And then one of the last things I'll talk about is the look of your podcast. Obviously you want to have your logo, you want to have your cover art. Those need to be things that stand out. I spend a lot of time on, my logo is my logo. I've changed it a couple of times, but the logo has been very good for me. As you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, you see the 12 Kyle. This is the old logo, the 12 Kyle podcast cup that I'm holding here. But I had, merch done from that. The cover arts I work on because I want something to stand out. I want something to, grab your attention. But I also think that it's very important that you work on your audio. There's nothing worse than listening to a podcast with bad audio. I cringe at it. And I was telling my homegirl Maya, shout out to Maya from the We Did That Shit podcast, who will be back on soon. Shout out to Maya and Babi. I was just telling her the other day that, like, one of the things that you have to do is make sure that the audio is tight because, at least for me, this podcast existed for 3 years before I even had a YouTube channel. So most of my audience is an audience from an audio perspective. So I understand I don't have, crazy YouTube numbers. I probably won't have crazy YouTube numbers, and I'm okay with that. But I always focus on the audio. The audio has to be up to par. If the audio don't sound right, trust me, you won't get this podcast. There is just the perfectionist in me. For one, I listen to every episode. You got to listen to your episodes. If you don't listen to your episodes, I don't understand how you can get better as a podcaster. But the person within me, I want to make sure that, I don't make as many mistakes, but trust me, there's a mistake in every episode. There might be a word that's flubbed. There might be a place where the audio, the beat doesn't hit where it's supposed to hit. Little things. And those little things that I catch, most of you won't ever catch. And last but not least, before I get out of here, you got to get the equipment. For most of us, you don't need to, particularly if you're just starting out, you don't need like a camera and all of that stuff. Like personally, I don't have a camera. I use the camera on my MacBook, and I got a microphone, and that's it. And but I've invested in the microphone. I remember my first microphone. I want to say, was it when I had the internet? Yeah, when I had the internet show, the 12 radio show. That was the name of it. That microphone was like $100. I think this microphone that you're looking at, if you're watching on YouTube, I think this microphone was like $250 or something like that. But I love the quality of it. Got some headphones. But you don't need a whole bunch of stuff. Some people go get mixers. If you're a beginner just getting started, I would not advise spending a ton of money, but spend your money wisely on quality. Don't worry about how much it costs, but as long as you get the quality, because ultimately you have to be satisfied with what it is that you create. And last but not least, for the love of the game, I love to hear podcasters who really love and enjoy what it is they're doing. The minute that you sound as if you're being bored, I'm not going to listen. And I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of what we see a lot now, particularly like on YouTube, of the guys or the girls, sitting around and you got a camera and everybody's, just shooting the shit. Those are turnoffs for me. I don't, because it's almost like, and this happens a lot with some athletes, some, not all. They understand the conversation, but we don't understand the conversation. And so like, it's almost like they're just talking to each other and not necessarily including the people that are listening and watching. That rolls for some people, but for others, like I just can't do it. Now there are some podcasts that I love watching like that. But for a lot of them, I don't. And like I said, just make sure that your audio is on point. If you don't have good audio, then you shouldn't even put it out, because ultimately that's what you're defined by. And in conclusion, I think if you want to start a podcast, I've given you a blueprint of what to do. The thing that I always tell people is I'll give you as much information as I have. And being in this for as long as I have a lot of information. I have a platform on Riverside, and I love Riverside. I'm not being paid by Riverside to endorse them right now, but what they've laid out has really, really been beneficial to me. And subsequently, I think the listeners and even people who've picked it up on YouTube and as well as IG or Facebook or what have you. But just be dedicated to the craft. If you're not going to be dedicated to the craft, then don't bother. Starting a podcast would be pointless. And, the thing that, the homie Uncle Dolomite talk about all the time, people don't care when you quit. If you get frustrated, I'm just going to quit this podcast. Nobody cares. I mean, that's just more people to listen to our podcast. But if you really want to get into it and enjoy it, and if you're prepared to do it for free, by all means, get in the game. There's plenty of room for everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. Thanks again for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We drop new episodes every Thursday. Please, ma'am, please, sir, hit the website, subscribe there. That way you won't miss any information on any of the podcasts. We don't spam your email, but you will get updates when new episodes drop. And from there, you can follow and listen on your favorite streaming platforms because they're connected to that particular website. That's going to do it for me. Thanks again for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. I'll catch you guys next time. 5,000. Cheers.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the 12 Kyle podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and share this podcast with a friend who needs the 12 Kyle podcast in their life. Every listen, every download, and every share helps us grow. Thanks for being a part of the 12 Kyle podcast community. We appreciate your support. We will catch you next time. 5,000.